Hello again, Mr. Majewski here, picking up after we had some technical malfunctions here in our first video. So I'm going to pick up right where we left off, and I believe that's right around question 8 and 9. So I'm going to start here on question 9. Briefly describe the outcome of the Mexican-American War. Okay, well, as we know, following President Polk and Zachary Taylor's actions which brought about the Mexican response, the first shots of the Mexican-American War, following the declaration by the United States that occurred following the issues on the Rio Grande with Zachary Taylor, the United States was absolutely prepared for war. They were prepared for battle. In fact, the U.S. already had armies in place ready to invade at the moment the declaration took place. So what happens is, when the declaration takes place, Zachary Taylor just keeps marching south. He's going to march south into central Mexico. He's going to win the deciding battle. It's called the Battle of Buena Vista. And when he wins that battle, he defeats the main Mexican army, I should say. While that's going on, another American army under a guy named Winfield Scott, he's going to invade Veracruz. He's going to capture Veracruz, Mexico. And then he marches westward. He actually captures Mexico City. When Mexico City falls, following the Battle of Buena Vista, then Mexico has no choice. They must accept surrender. All right, so Taylor and Scott are our heroes of the Mexican War. Taylor for his victory at Buena Vista, Scott for the capture of Mexico City. You should also know that the Americans had navies off the coast of California. They did, in fact, invade as soon as they found out about the declaration as well, and so California became part of the United States, or was captured by U.S. troops as well. All right, in fact, John Fremont, the future presidential candidate, was the man who was responsible for seizing California during the conflict. So that's kind of the outcome. It was a short war, about 2.5 years, and overwhelmingly it was an American victory, American success. Again, once Mexico City falls, then, of course, the Mexican government really had no choice. They had to accept American peace offers. Speaking of those peace offers, let's go to number 10. Describe the terms and effects of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the Mexican War. Well, we know what happens. All right, the United States is going to acquire a massive amount of land. It's called the Mexican Cession. It includes what is today California, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Colorado, parts of Utah, and of course parts of Texas as well. All right. They forced Mexico to sign this treaty. It gives the United States an incredible amount of land. If you actually remember, the U.S. paid millions of dollars to Mexico because they realized, hey, we're kind of taking a lot here. And I think there was a little bit of remorse, and it made the Americans feel a little bit better if they actually paid for at least part of this land they had just taken. What is the effect of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? Well, one, the relationship between the United States and Mexico is negatively affected. Secondly, and more importantly for us here, this means that the slavery issue is going to be reignited. Because now that we have all this new territory, now again, Northerners and Southerners are going to ask the question, what the heck are we going to do with it? All right, so ultimately, the Mexican Cession reignites the slavery issue. During Manifest Destiny, slavery kind of died down. Americans really focused on just expanding. Now that we have expanded, now that we've acquired this land, it now becomes, what the heck are we going to do with it? Suddenly, both sides are competing with each other again. All righty. Now we're going to move on to number 11. Be sure that you can describe African American culture on the plantation related to music, religion, and family patterns. Okay, we're going to start with music. Music was very important to African culture. Drums and rhythm were very common in African tribes. They tried to maintain these traditions when they came to the plantation. It was difficult because, remember, hundreds of different languages could conceivably be spoken from the various tribes. Religion is going to be very mixed. And so a lot of times they tried to preserve what culture they could, and music was one of them. Now they did have a lot of rhythm beats. Alrighty, again, they had used drums in the past. They were forbidden from using drums a lot of times on plantations. A lot of times they would just keep the beat by, well, patting on their bodies. It was called patting juba. Alrighty, when it came to singing, generally they preferred something called the call and response technique. That's where one person sang the solo, and then the rest of the plantation or the rest of the group would sing the chorus back. So it was almost like one person would say a line, and then everybody would repeat that same line over and over and over again. Alrighty, that's called call and response. That, along with the rhythmic beats, the patting juba, those were kind of common in African American plantation society. Alrighty. Other music, for instance, the banjo was African. Alrighty, it's an African kind of guitar, and later on it's going to be used not only by blacks on the plantation but whites as well. All right. So musically, incredible influences on the plantation. Look, blues, jazz, rock and roll, none of those things develop without these incredible influences from blacks on the plantation. Alrighty. In terms of religion, again, so many different blended religions here. Coming from Africa, we have hundreds of tribes there, all right, and they're all pushed together onto the same plantations. A lot of these slaves might have spent some time, or their families spent some time in the Caribbean, and so they might have acquired some Caribbean religion as well, like Santeria. And then, of course, they come to the United States. Many of them have elements of Christianity as well, are going to convert to Christianity. So a lot of times there was a mixture of religion. It was a mixture of African religious traditions and beliefs with Christian ones, maybe with a little bit of a fusing from the Caribbean as well. Alrighty, so religion was a real mix. It was unique. We had these unique religions, just like this music, that formed on the plantation that didn't exist anywhere else in the world at that time. Alrighty. You should know that Christianity was very popular with slaves because of the messages in Christianity. A lot of messages about, dealing with slavery, all right, and leading your people to freedom, achieving liberty or freedom. And so slaves, those messages really resonated with a lot of slaves. Let's remember, Christianity didn't really help the slave out much in terms of their freedom. Even if you converted, of course, there was no requirement or guarantee that you maintained your freedom. All right? Family patterns. Look, the plantation was made up of mixtures of people. All right? Families were usually broken up at the slave auction. And so the plantation would be filled with many different people, oftentimes folks that might not have any immediate or blood relatives with them. And so this concept of the extended family developed on the plantation, almost like it takes an entire village to raise a child. All of the women pitched in to raise the children together. On top of that, it was very common in African society, in African American society on the plantation, to develop what was called fictive kin. Where you almost adopted people into your family as extended family members. You might call them Uncle Joe or, Aunt Irene or whatever. You gave them family names, family titles, even though they weren't actually part of your family because they had nobody else, all right? So you almost adopted them into the plantation. Uncle Tom's Cabin actually is a great example of this. Uncle Tom was fictive kin to other people on that plantation, all righty? Anyways, very unique patterns that develop on those plantations. They didn't exist anywhere in the world, and they absolutely influence American society all the way up until today. 12, what were the conditions for slaves like on many southern plantations? Harsh, brutal, punishments were severe, the treatment was intolerable, a lot of physical abuse, obvious verbal abuse, a lot of mental abuse, of course sexual abuse as well took place. Generally speaking, the more south you were, the more brutal it was, the harsher, the stricter it was, because the more dependent on slavery the whites were. All right, so the Deep South was generally considered the worst. You need to remember a couple of things. Most Southerners didn't own slaves, 90%. All righty, of the Southerners that did own slaves, most of them owned very few of them. This concept that there were these massive plantations everywhere where slave owners owned hundreds of slaves, that was very rare, that was very unusual. All righty. Usually it was the larger plantations that were harsher or more strict because they were the ones that could afford most to replace slaves. Remember, generally slaves were very expensive. Okay? Let's go to 13. What was the first major anti-slavery society in the United States? It was the American Colonization Society. It was founded in the late 1810s, early 1820s. Their goal was not to allow blacks to live freely with whites in the United States. They wanted blacks to be free, and then they wanted all blacks to go back to Africa. They wanted to relocate them, recolonize them back to Africa. The white people that came up with this society actually pooled their money. They bought land in Africa. They created a country called Liberia, liberty, freedom, and then they encouraged about 10,000 free blacks to move back there and to settle it. Ultimately, Liberia still exists today, alrighty. Its flag looks a lot like the United States flag. It was founded by free blacks, and the descendants of those free blacks still live in Liberia today, all right? The biggest problem for the ACS, the American Colonization Society, was they couldn't find enough free blacks to go. Most African Americans, once they got their freedom, wanted to stay. They considered themselves American. Most had been born here, so they had no connection to Africa. They preferred to stay inside the United States. Eventually, the American Colonization Society is going to be replaced by more radical groups, but it is technically the very first abolitionist society in our nation's history. Okay? We're going to move down here to number 14. Who was William Lloyd Garrison? What was the Liberator? Look, William Lloyd Garrison is a really famous radical abolitionist, one of the first radical abolitionists. He is one of the first, he's from the Northeast, alrighty. He basically writes this famous pamphlet, this newspaper, it's called The Liberator, and he basically says, hey, from this point forward, I'm not going to accept anything less than the immediate, uncompensated freedom of all African slaves. We need to be free. They need to be freed immediately. Southern slave owners should get nothing. He depicts Southerners as bad, as evil, or at least slave owners as evil. He says we're fighting the good fight, they're fighting the bad fight. Ultimately, he's considered to be one of the first radical abolitionists to really get this movement going. Radical abolitionists called for absolute equality, absolute freedom immediately for all slaves. Very different than the American Colonization Society, which had come before it, okay? You should know that Garrison and other radical abolitionists during this time were generally viewed very negatively by most Americans. They were kind of viewed as troublemakers, as rabble-rousers, as people who were going to sink us into a war if they didn't start being more quiet. Not until the 1850s, after Uncle Tom's Cabin, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, did most Northerners start to become more sympathetic to these radical abolitionists. Alrighty? Anyways, you need to know Garrison, you need to know the Liberator, because they are so significant. By the way, Garrison starts the Liberator in 1831, alright? So he's fighting this fight 30 years before the Civil War actually occurs, okay? 15, who were some of the famous white and black abolitionists? We mentioned Garrison, all right? You need to know Wendell Phillips. He's considered the greatest speaker or orator. He was called the Golden Trumpet of abolition. When they needed him to when they needed an abolitionist to give the great speeches, to fire people up, to motivate the crowds, they sent Wendell Phillips, all right? Some other names that you need to be aware of: Frederick Douglass is our most famous African-American abolitionist. He is a genius. He's one of the great Americans in our history. He was pretty much self-taught. Ultimately, he is going to become the spokesperson for the African-American abolitionist movement. Interestingly about him, he didn't think violence was the only solution. He actually said we need to have some sort of political result. Otherwise, slavery can be brought back in the future. All right. David Walker was another abolitionist. He was African American. He argued for violence. All right. He wanted violence to be used by slaves. Abolition by any means necessary. All right. Finally, one last African American abolitionist you'll need to know. Her name is Sojourner Truth. Remember, she was an older African American woman. She was both a civil rights and a abolitionist leader. Her most famous speech, Ain't I a Woman, criticized not only the treatment of women, but also the treatment of blacks as well. Hey, we had others. We had other famous abolitionists as well. You know, the Grimke sisters were in the South, Angelina and Sarah as well. Okay? But ultimately, those are kind of the majors that you really need to be aware of. And I think, yeah, we already kind of answered how radicals were viewed by most Northerners. 16, what was the GAC Resolution? The GAC Resolution was a bill that was passed in Congress by Southerners in the 1830s. It was around for about 8 years, from 1836 to 1844. And what it said was, any time that a Northerner in Congress attempted to bring up slavery or abolition, immediately the GAC Resolution said all discussion on the topic stopped and Congress shut down. All right, so because they're fearful that the North at some point is going to try to take slavery away, the Southerners passed this bill which said, hey, you can't even mention it on the floor of Congress. That way, there never can be a bill that's proposed that will take our slaves away in the future. If you recall, many Northerners, especially abolitionists, were outraged by this. John Quincy Adams, the old president, comes back into Congress. He goes back into the House specifically to beat this bill, and he does it after 8 years of work. It's finally defeated in 1844. Alrighty, so one of the attempts by Southerners to try to preserve slavery in Congress was the GAC Resolution until it was overturned in 1844. Okay? Another example of how Southerners tried to slow abolitionist ideas. They banned all they banned all abolitionist material from the mail system in the South. If abolitionist pamphlets or letters or papers, were sent to a Southern state to be delivered, they weren't delivered. They would be intercepted, they would be destroyed, of course this isn't illegal, this isn't permitted, this isn't legal, alrighty, but ultimately Southerners did it anyways. Okay, so not only the GAC Resolution, but also banning all all abolitionist material throughout the South, okay? I should say probably the Brooks-Sumner affair, in a way, is kind of designed by Southerners to get Northerners to be quiet, right? When Charles Sumner speaks up on slavery in Congress, what happens to him? He's beaten by Preston Brooks, okay? Let's go to number 17. What was popular sovereignty in the Wilmot Proviso? Popular sovereignty, remember, is this idea that the people in a territory, later a state, are going to decide for themselves whether they should be free or slave. This was decided by the Democrats. This was come up with by the Democratic Party. Not surprisingly, they're mostly they got a lot of Southerners who liked popular sovereignty, basically. It developed because the federal government couldn't come up with a solution to the slavery issue. Since they couldn't seem to come up with any sort of national policy, they just left it up to the individual territories and states to decide for themselves. Again, Southerners liked popular sovereignty because, generally speaking, it gave them opportunity to have slavery in all territories and states. Northerners generally opposed it, especially when it came to popular sovereignty in the new territories out west, okay? What was the Wilmot Proviso? Wilmot Proviso was an attempt right after the Mexican-American War. It was an attempt by Northern congressmen in 1848 to try to prevent slavery from expanding anywhere into the Mexican cession. They tried to pass this bill that said all of the Mexican cession is going to be free. Southerners found out about it. They defeated it, they blocked it, and we like to say that the Wilmot Proviso is the point when the slavery issue is reignited again. Remember, it died down during Manifest Destiny. Now that Southerners realize what the North is up to, what David Wilmot and his fellow Northern congressmen are up to, they go back to preserving, to trying to defend slavery. Manifest Destiny dies down, we go right back to this slavery sectionalism issue again. All right, so that's the significance of the Wilmot Proviso. 18, the election of 1848. We know Zachary Taylor is going to win that election. Why? Because he ignores the issue of slavery, which seems crazy to us. The nation is very paralyzed by this issue with fear, and so they go with the general, who was very popular, who really promised not to address slavery one way or the other. Of course, we know Taylor dies in office, Millard Fillmore takes over, and ultimately, it's going to be Fillmore who's going to agree to that compromise of 1850. Alrighty, but before that can happen, of course, we had the California Gold Rush. Remember, gold is discovered out west. We have the 48ers and the 49ers who head out west to try to strike it rich. Most do not, but since there's flocks of people that go to California, California is eligible for statehood. And so therefore, because California is going to be admitted as either a free state or a slave state, again, this sectionalism issue is going to reignite once more. Alrighty. The Underground Railroad and the Fugitive Slave Law. Well, we know what the Underground Railroad is. It developed in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. It was a network that helped slaves escape up to the north. Usually they ended up in Canada. Again, it was a series of secret routes, homes, buildings that were hideouts that could be used. They would, hide out during the day, and they would move at night. What would happen is what were called conductors, usually former slaves, would come down. They would help these slaves to escape. They would lead them to freedom. Since it was called an underground railroad, where people went from house to house to house by foot, the person who led them, that guided them along the way, was known as the conductor of the railroad. Harriet Tubman was the most famous of these conductors. She made many, many trips down into the South, even though she herself was an escaped slave. If she had been captured, she would have been brought back probably and forced to become a slave again. She led hundreds of people to their freedom. Ultimately, she was called the Moses of her people because she led so many to freedom out of slavery. All right, she's the most famous conductor by far. She's really the only one